Welcome to Season 5 of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from around the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Heron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks for watching the show. Enjoy. So welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Ijeoma Njaka, who serves as a Senior Project Associate for Equity-Centered Design at the Red House and an Inclusive Pedagogy Specialist for the Laboratory of Global Performance and Politics at Georgetown University. She is passionate about inclusive pedagogy and anti-bias education for students, faculty, and staff, with a particular emphasis on arts-based practices. She co-teaches courses in performance-based dialogic pedagogy and speculative design, which we will unpack in a minute. During her time as a grad student at Georgetown, she launched and curated Invisibility at Georgetown, Past, Present, and Future, an art exhibit which highlighted the work and experiences of marginalized students. Welcome to the show, Ijeoma.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So, I came to know of your work in a really strange way because somebody forwarded me a link to a little video of a PBS NewsHour bit on this program that you're part of called In Your Shoes. So let's start there. Could you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yes. So the In Your Shoes program began a few years ago, so maybe, about 3 years ago, started by my colleagues at Georgetown, Professor Derek Goldman and Professor Dan Brumberg. And so what the In Your Shoes sort of project overall is rooted in this practice that my colleague Derek Goldman came up with called performing one another. So what we do there is we have two individuals. We ask them to come together and to have a conversation. And the conversation can be sort of any type of prompt. It can be about home. It can be about a thing that you've loved. But we ask them to have an earnest conversation. But we also ask them to record the conversation. So after they talk, they have the recorded conversation separately. We'll ask each person to transcribe a chunk of what their partner said that they found interesting or resonant, and we ask them to transcribe it verbatim. So that includes like all the likes, the ums, the ahs, any laughter. And, we transcribe it, they create a script. And as we come back together as a group, each person will perform their partner as their partner to their partner. And so that exercise involves, hearing your own words sort of kind of back at you as interpreted by somebody else, but also doing the same to someone else to show that you're sort of listening to them really deeply. So for what we've done in various versions of In Your Shoes, and the one that was on PBS, is we've done this work with undergraduate students at Georgetown and then undergraduate students at a place called Patrick Henry College, which is a small conservative Christian institution in Purposeful, Virginia, and just very different student bodies and very different life experiences, and we bring them together to have conversations so that they get to know folks from different perspectives.
So, okay, I love this so much.
Yeah.
Right? Especially somebody who likes pedagogy and kind of experiential learning.
Yeah.
You've probably experienced it yourself. You've probably done the experience, and you've probably witnessed the experience several times.
Yeah.
Could you share something that's stayed with you, has moved you, either from your personal experience or just having witnessed it?
Yeah. One of our students who participated in the program last year just kept on, revisiting. She's like, it's so strange. Usually when you're having a conversation with somebody, the words just sort of disappear, into the ether, like you say them and then they're gone and that moment passes. But to hear someone capture that and say what you're saying back to you, it's just, she just finds that such an uncommon experience that we're having in the world, generally speaking. And so what I think is also really fascinating about it, what I enjoy out of it as well, is actually the transcriptions and the performances of people saying and thinking and having all that be part of it, because it shows that someone is trying really hard to sort of articulate their ideas. And so, as an educator, I really like it when people are thinking. So that I would find really exciting. But also, I don't know when people are doing such embodied listening in that way in other circumstances. And so because it's different and because it's uncommon, it ends up resonating in a really particular way, which I find really exciting.
Yeah. And are you finding that people who have very different lived experiences through that process have like a little window of opening that didn't exist before?
Yeah, for sure. I think what I found really interesting about our students, particularly when we've brought the Georgetown students and Patrick Henry college students together, is that students will have these conversations, and after they perform each other, they'll like laugh about it. They'll be like, "Whoa!" And then they'll be like, "I want to keep talking to you more." Like, you know, like, and they're making friends, and we've had like really strong friendships and robust relationships come out of this process, which is really incredible. So yeah, I find that really validating too.
And don't you think in 2021 we need a little bit more of listening and bridge building, eh? I mean,
yeah.
As an aside.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, yeah, I was going to say it's for us, you know, for this project in particular and that iteration, I feel like that aside ends up being kind of front and center. I feel like a lot of the students who've been part of this program have expressed interest in it. You know, I think they're cognizant of like the ways in which, you know, obviously social media sort of broadly, but even just college campuses, you know, they're sort of constructed to be places where people have a shared identity and have shared beliefs and a shared experience. And I think that sometimes students are, you know, they're aware that like I'm having this particular experience here, but I also know that there are others that I'm not privy to because I'm here. And so I appreciate that a lot, that we have these students who like have that wherewithal to be like, you know, like let me try something that's different and weird, so that I can, you know, talk to somebody who I otherwise would not be talking to.
Right. Now, we're going to include the link to the PBS NewsHour in the description before, and some information about like how to read about this in your shoes, the website on Georgetown. But let's go back to like your work. Earlier, when I introduced you, I mentioned these very fancy words: dialogic, pedagogy, and speculative design.
Yeah.
So could you tell us what that is before we get into more of the rest of the conversation?
I know. I was like, in case you couldn't tell, like I'm an academic. When I say performance-based dialogic pedagogy, basically, I'm talking about the Industries Project. For me, dialogic pedagogy is kind of like what you said before, having an experience while we're learning, and where that learning is centered around having a conversation with other people. So that's that. That's the root of that. For the speculative design work. Trying to figure out the best way to sort of sum that up. It's about the practice of imagining things, and particularly imagining, like futures, and so the work that I do, sort of around that is in higher education. You know, I'm at the institution of Georgetown, which has a really particular history in connection to enslavement and particularly as a formerly slaveholding institution. And so for us to think about, you know, different versions of a racially just Georgetown, or a racially just future, or a future of higher education, that's what that speculative design is. It's, you know, trying to imagine the different, you know, sort of opening up our minds to imagine a variety of different realities, and then seeing like, well, if we imagine this, what can we do right now that can get closer to that, or what steps can we take to sort of get there?
That's so interesting. Help? Yeah, it really does. Because you know what it makes me think of? So there's Dr. Muhammad Yunus, the gentleman who he's a Nobel laureate for his work in microfinance out of Bangladesh. And I've heard him speak a few times, and he talks about social fiction. He says, you know, we have science fiction where, you know, authors write about these like futuristic things, and then lo and behold, off we are in the moon, and now we're communicating over the internet. Like science fiction becomes reality. And he said, wouldn't it be great if we had social fiction, like zero poverty or zero carbon emissions or zero, you know? And I think that's what you're kind of suggesting, right?
No, 100%. Yeah, I feel like that's all really resonant. And yeah, you know, I also think about, definitely in there's a class that I co-teach where we talk about speculative design. You know, we'll read, you know, Octavia Butler, but, you know, and then some speculative fiction, but we'll also, you know, reference, you know, theories like emergent strategy, or, you know, the idea that social change movements are, speculative fiction, which I'm quoting. I'm quoting emergent strategy. That's not an original thought, or I'm quoting Marisha. I'm quoting somebody.
Okay, so we've covered those words and terms, and now I would love to explore with you what close looking means, or means to you, and how does it cultivate empathy? What does this close looking mean to you?
Yeah, so close looking. I actually stumbled across this term and this practice at a conference that I went to. This conference was for folks who are trained in doing professional development for faculty, so people who help faculty teach better, which is part of what my graduate studies was in. And so, so I was at this conference, and we went to a museum in Portland, and we were looking at a particular, it wasn't even a statue, it was like an artifact, some like very, very old water pitcher type of thing. And we stared at it for 10 minutes in silence and looked at it. We got up and we walked around it and peered at it from different angles. And then we tried to draw it. And then we sort of like wrote down all of our questions about it. And by the time, by the time we left, I could still, even now, this was a couple years ago, I could still picture that thing in my head. I don't remember what it's called, but, I remember that I remember that I studied it. And so, I think close looking for me, and sort of borrowed from that museum education sort of practices, and also just arts education in general, is the practice of staring at something for so long that you discover new things about it, or like engaging with something for so long that you discover new things about it, discover different dimensions of it, and begin to almost see it anew because you're looking at it for so long. And so, yeah.
No, keep going. I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah. So for me, what that ends up looking like in my work, the In Your Shoes project, for example, like that is very much an exercise in close looking. If as we have our participants or our students who are looking at a recording of a conversation and trying to excerpt pieces of it, they have to listen to it a couple of times. Then they're transcribing it, so they're sort of like reformatting it in a different way. They have to listen really closely to make sure that they're transcribing it accurately. Then they need, we ask them to read through it a couple of times before we perform it back. So they're, trying really hard to like be faithful to it and trying to, and as they're doing that, they're sort of having this like embodied practice. So they're probably starting to think about, okay, well, what was my partner feeling or thinking when they were, like sitting like this or like looking up like this, like what was happening there. And then, as we're sort of performing back to someone else, that person's, the partner then, as they're hearing their own words, starts to sort of think about things that they've said, some of the words of their own in a different way. They're sort of negotiating or interacting with their thoughts in a way that they hadn't before. And for the person who has sort of transcribed that and sort of gone through that process, they know something really, really well about this person who, before they had done this exercise, they hadn't known before. So yeah. I think close looking's great.
I love that. So many things come up for me. So one is my husband's a self-taught painter. He does watercolor painting, and he paints based on like photographs. So he has a photograph on his computer, and then he reproduces it. And he'll tell me like 3 weeks into working on a painting, he's like, I've just discovered that there's purple in here.
Yeah, right.
And I don't see the purple at all. That's one thing. The second thing that comes to mind is, it reminds me of the eye gazing exercises, right? Like when you look into each other's eyes, you can kind of sink into a different level of modality. Like on one level, you see the features, but then you start to communicate and then you start to resonate. So I love all of that. And then there was a third thing that you made me think of. Okay, well, maybe it'll come back to me. That's okay. So in general, you believe that the arts can foster empathy, right? And 100%. I think that there's like a long lineage of that. And yet, schools don't give it nearly as much attention as it should. Like, the arts and culture stuff gets gutted out if there's any kind of budget cuts. And we all kind of think of like arts and culture as, sweet and love to have, but like not necessary to our humanity. Right. So tell me a little bit about why you think it's so important, and especially to forging or cultivating empathy.
Right. Yeah. So for me, it starts with my background and interest in inclusive pedagogy. So, anti-bias, anti-racist teaching, and creating equitable classroom spaces. Like that's ultimately an exercise in empathy and seeing somebody else's humanity. And particularly when I was a graduate student, where, I was focusing on faculty development and helping to coach faculty in inclusive teaching. it was very evident to me that the same folks kept showing up to those workshop sessions, and we were trying to figure out, like, how do we reach people who are not necessarily inclined to be here? You know, how do you encourage people to be empathetic about a thing that they're not necessarily cognizant of? And because of a couple of experiences that I had in the arts, including one very transformative experience at a museum exhibit and just some more sort of other readings that I was doing, I was like, well, you know, there's literature, particularly coming from the arts world, about what happens when people engage with the arts that are around empathy or around sort of fostering empathy, fostering tolerance, and, you know, having an experience with art sort of forces folks, because of the nature of artwork, to look at something in a new way, look at the world in a new way. And so, you know, I dove into museum education, and by that I mean I took one class, also took a class in the public humanities, so, you know, there's some overlap. Yeah, I thought to myself, like, what if we were sort of engaging with artwork on a wider scale as part of this sort of faculty development work that I'm doing? You know, like, what if we had faculty look at more artwork so that maybe they would feel more empathetic about students of marginalized backgrounds in their classroom? What would that change? What would that do? And so that was, you know, ended up being a project of mine when I was a graduate student. But that's sort of in that pursuit. I discovered that, you know, as practical as it sounds, you know, the arts are actually really underutilized for, you know, sort of for those of us, I think, in that venue of doing social work, or social justice oriented work or empathy based work, particularly, you know, from where I sit, particularly in higher ed. So that ended up being how I got to empathy. You know, I was thinking, like, okay, if I'm trying to sort of work towards, you know, having more folks on board with, you know, an equitable, just education system, but I need to figure out how to get them to care about that, you know, reading literature and reading scholarship actually is not super effective for, you know, sort of onboarding folks, but arts-based experiences actually are really effective in at least sort of opening up a different worldview for people. And so that's sort of how I came to it. And yeah, that's sort of what I get to do in my work, which I'm actually, excited about and surprised.
So you make me think of this professor that I spoke to. He taught at Concordia for some time and was a sustainability prof in a management faculty before sustainability was really kind of had hit its sweet spot where everybody knew about climate change. So more than 10 years ago now. And he was a tango dancer. And one day he discovered that tango, like, he was trying to like unpack, why does he love to dance so much? And it's so like, it's innovative because you're making it up as you go, and it's like always something novel and new. And he was reflecting on like why it was so important to him in his life to have this expression. And it was kind of like on the notion of arts and culture. And he realized that all the work that he'd been doing to sort of like make the case for why sustainability is so important for like the longevity of us as species on the planet and the well-being of the earth. He's like, it's not by telling people with facts, it's by engaging them with affect. And I think that's what you're suggesting, is that if we can bring people to feel things as a result of their interaction with arts, then that opens stuff up for more proclivity to empathy elsewhere, right? Yeah, no, totally.
And I think about one of the scholars who I'm basically obsessed with. Her name is Sarah Elizabeth Lewis. She's she's a curator and a professor at Harvard, and she runs a thing called the Vision and Justice Project. And in that, her ethos is, the sort of, emotive and affectual, responses that people have when looking at engaging with art can actually engender a lot of social change, particularly around racial justice work, which is sort of one of her emphases. But 100% what you're saying. Yeah, it's having that emotional sort of engagement that's not purely just like strictly thinking or strictly logical actually ends up opening up a lot.
So you were talking about this sculpture and looking at it from all these different angles and seeing something differently, right? So just so happened a couple of nights ago, I watched with my husband this talk given by like some scientific group about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, and how, they were being studied in the 50s and 60s, and then, Nixon came down hard, and then it stopped, and now all of a sudden it's got this renaissance. And one of the speakers on the panel was a woman who actually studies the brain of children and how it's different from the brain of adults. And so one of the things she was saying is that children's brains, because their neural connections are not fully formed, and they're not as thick in the brain, like they're not as dense. There's so many opportunities to create linkages and see things in different perspectives. And then when we become adults, we fast track, our neural connections just go faster because we just take shortcuts. And apparently the psychedelic experience allows that openness to come back, where we can see things from different perspectives. So I just wonder, I ask if you've come across anything, like, in the psychedelic world that's kind of touching your work at all.
Not explicit. Well, not quite in that way. So I've, one of the projects that I've been working on, has been around, is with the Wellbeing Project. And it's around, intergenerational trauma, but looking at and sort of addressing and trying to heal intergenerational trauma as a way to advance social change work, and broader well-being. And so through part of that work, I co-authored a piece a couple months ago on intergenerational trauma. And so my colleague, my co-author, has been really interested in the sort of the work of psychedelics, and sort of how that can help with well-being, generally speaking, and particularly around like mental health and that type of thing. And so I've encountered it sort of that way. So my co-author has been really into it, and has been sort of like talking to me about it. But I would like to look into that more around like how that
me too. I'm super curious.
Yeah.
Okay, well, as a final question, I've gotten into this habit of asking guests if they can think of a story, and it's not to put you on the spot, but if you can think of a story, it doesn't have to be a big story, but it can be anything that comes to mind, about a time when you were on the receiving end of empathy, or what I call purposeful empathy, so empathy on purpose, and what that meant for you, if you felt like sharing.
Yes, no, I have a story. Which is about, this happened last year. And so for me, I've been out of grad school for a couple of years, but I'm very much in touch still with my advisor and mentor. And so we had been talking, we were in touch because we are generally in touch, particularly last summer, sort of in the wake of the Black Lives Matters protests, and the murder of George Floyd, which for me, I'm originally from Minnesota. And so like that felt, it felt particularly resonant, in different ways. And, I had been talking with him actually about sort of the process of, folks having reached out to be like, oh yeah, like Ijeoma, like I'm reaching out to Black friends to like see how they're doing. And I was talking to my advisor, and I was like, I had that experience. And I was like, I kind of didn't like it when people were reaching out about that. And I told him part of the reason of that is because, in the summer and in June, my father passed away, in the month of June, 3 years ago. And so, I just sort of have my own kind of personal grief season that's happening. And so, I was like, I wish, I was telling my advisor, like, I wish somebody would just reach out to me about my dad, or like something, or as opposed to what they think I'm feeling, or because they feel guilty or something like that. And so, my advisor, he was like, okay, well, like, what are some things you're doing to honor your dad or to think about your dad during this time? So we chatted about it. And I was like, I eat a lot of foods that my dad likes, including like Captain Crunch, peanut butter crunch. Like that was the thing my dad really likes. So like, gonna be eating that this month. And he was like, yeah, that's a great cereal. And then later, we had a rest conversation, but then later that day, my advisor texted me and he was like, I had a bowl of peanut butter crunch and I thought about your dad. And I was like, this is why he's my forever advisor.
I love that story. Oh, thank you for sharing that. I'm very touched.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that you lost your dad, obviously, but what a sweet gesture of empathic action, right? Oh.
Yeah, no, it definitely resonated with me for I'm glad I got to share it.
Thank you for that. Well, it was such a delight to chit chat, and I'm so excited about the work that you're doing, and I can't wait to put this podcast out to the world. So thank you, Ijeoma, and thank you all for watching and listening.
Yeah, thank you.
See you next time at the next season, the next episode of Purposeful Empathy.
What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free from your thinking clutter, or make an important decision, or liberate you from whatever's holding you back? At Grand Heron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice from any place, anytime. Visit grandheroninternational.com and harness the power on-demand coaching today.